The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this AYSO webinar, which will present detailed information on AYSO's policies and procedures related to paying for services. The intended audience for this webinar includes regional commissioners and their regional board members, area directors and area staffs, section directors and section staffs, and any other interested parties who are responsible for putting on AYSO-sponsored programs and activities. Throughout this webinar, we will use the term AYSO entity to refer to one or more AYSO regions, areas, or sections that conduct a soccer program or activities. For example, a tournament is an AYSO-sponsored activity which may be put on by a single AYSO region or multiple AYSO regions, or sometimes by an AYSO area or an AYSO section. These policies and procedures apply to any and all of those entities. After the webinar, if you have further questions or other thoughts, they can be sent via email to memberservices@ayso.org. Please enter "Paying for Services" in the subject line of any email message. So, why are we presenting a webinar on this topic? Well, in AYSO, we think we do a pretty good job of explaining the what behind AYSO's policies and procedures. However, we believe that by taking the time to explain to you the why of these recent actions, it will contribute to your broader understanding of and compliance with the what. Well, as you can imagine, this headline in the New York Times got our interest about 4 years ago. The story described an investigation by the IRS into the practices of a Fairfield, Connecticut youth soccer club. Thankfully, this wasn't an AYSO region, but there were definitely implications for AYSO. This club had some 48 teams in several age divisions, both girls and boys. This gives you some idea about the size of this club's operation compared to your own AYSO program. As is typical in this type of club operation, the coach trainers were paid a per-player stipend by the club in the form of a monthly check written by the club treasurer. Additionally, on game day, referees were paid in cash on the field by the coach or other representative of each team. The club considered them all to be independent contractors and therefore did not complete other paperwork or withhold taxes. Following an audit of the club's books and practices, the IRS determined that these coaches and referees were, in fact, employees based on IRS standards. As a result, the IRS cited the soccer club for failure to withhold and pay taxes over the 2-year period covered by the investigation. The bill to the club for just the 2 years covered by the audit amounted to over $334,000 for back taxes and penalties. Here's why this was so concerning to AYSO. Most soccer clubs are registered as small businesses and formally incorporated in the state where they operate, most frequently as a nonprofit. As a nonprofit corporation, the club has the obligation to maintain good financial records of its income and expenses, comply with all federal, state, and local laws and regulations, and to file any and all required tax forms. AYSO, on the other hand, is a single nonprofit corporation. All the 1,000 or so AYSO entities are basically affiliates of this single parent corporation. AYSO has all the same obligations of the club. The AYSO National Accounting Program, known as NAP, provides personnel at the national office with the information from our local entities they need to maintain the books of the corporation, and, in turn, that personnel prepare and file all required tax returns. Under this corporate structure, any liability arising out of the activities conducted by any of these entities becomes a liability of the entire organization. There are some 900 AYSO regions, almost 100 AYSO areas, and 15 AYSO sections across the country. All told, each year, the combined activities of these AYSO entities make AYSO a $70 million business. Make no mistake, AYSO represents deep pockets, financially speaking, to the IRS and to others. AYSO is creating new regions all the time, but existing regions close from time to time as well. The National Board of Directors saw an increasing number of regions being closed because local leaders reported they lacked the volunteer base to continue to provide a good AYSO experience. Also, there were a number of existing soccer groups attracted by AYSO's core philosophies and our approach to teaching the game to kids, which had expressed strong interest in becoming AYSO regions. However, to sustain a quality experience in their local community, they could not abandon their use of paid referees, and so eventually chose not to come over, which was a loss for those kids, we think. A year or so ago, an unfortunate instance in a tournament setting sent chills through the board of directors. The sponsoring AYSO entity arranged for a local vendor to prepare and sell food on site during the weekend-long competition. An outbreak of salmonella poisoning sent several people to local hospitals. Fortunately, all survived, but an investigation by the local authorities determined that the vendor was unlicensed and uninsured. Remember what we said earlier about the liability of any one AYSO entity being the liability of the whole organization? Well, AYSO dodged a bullet on this one. Yes, AYSO does maintain insurance for these types of matters. However, the number and size of the claims against AYSO rise. They could contribute to an increase in insurance premiums, and we would run the risk that the insurance might not even be available if the losses grow too great. In the past year or so, a number of newly appointed regional commissioners have sought the assistance of the national office and members of the AYSO Legal Commission in extracting them from service agreements signed by their predecessor, and frequently without the knowledge of the regional board. These agreements obligated the region to pay thousands of dollars. In one case we know of, payments amounted to 6 figures. And the description of the services to be provided and records of the services actually delivered left much to be desired. These agreements, prepared by the vendors in most cases, had AYSO assuming all of the liabilities in the event of any legal action arising out of the services being provided. In a few cases, family members of the former executive member were found to be employees of the vendor. This lack of transparency in any oversight on AYSO's behalf was also of great concern to the board of directors. So in January 2009, with all this information in hand, the AYSO National Board of Directors chose to modify National Policy Statement 2.5. The board reaffirmed its support for AYSO's long-standing dedication to volunteers. However, the board also recognized the increasing demands for the time of dual-income and single-parent families. The board decided in instances where an AYSO entity determines that children may not get to play, or that the entity's ability to deliver a quality experience is hampered due to a shortage of volunteers, that those entities should be able to use paid personnel to fulfill certain duties that had historically been provided by volunteers. The national office was directed to prepare policies and procedures for AYSO entities to use when engaging services for hire. This involved significant research and consultation with attorneys specializing in employment and tax laws to ensure that any such arrangement minimized or eliminated any liability on the part of AYSO or its individual members. A key element to meeting that objective is reliance on the use of independent contractors when paying for services. AYSO entities must avoid any situation that may create an employer-employee relationship. Only independent contractors can be used by AYSO entities when providing services for pay. Now, one can't just declare a person to be an independent contractor. The IRS has strict guidelines they use to make that determination. However, there are some key elements that, if present in the relationship, go a long way toward meeting those IRS standards. For instance, independent contractors typically provide the same or similar services to other businesses and people in the community. They have all the training, tools, and other equipment needed to perform the work. Independent contractors are a bona fide business concern, and therefore would have the necessary workers' compensation and liability insurance to cover any employees and to protect AYSO. The most important element is that the AYSO entity have little or no control over the process and methods of how the job is done by an independent contractor. Independent contractor status is further ensured through use of a written agreement between any provider and AYSO that details the services to be provided, the amounts to be paid, and confirms the relationship between the parties. AYSO has prepared template agreements to use. There are blanks to fill in specific to each engagement. These agreements, reviewed and approved by the AYSO Legal Commission, must be used as written and sent to the National Office for signature by the National Executive Director. Failure to do so could make the individual signing the agreement personally liable for any fines or penalties that might arise from the agreement and subject him or her to further disciplinary action by AYSO. We want to be clear that not all business arrangements conducted by any AYSO entity fall into this category. These policies and procedures apply to any vendor paid with money by the region, area, or section for delivering a service. These provisions do not apply when paying a vendor for materials or supplies or some other commodity. Examples of arrangements where these policies and procedures apply would be a webmaster who uses his own hardware and software to design, build, and maintain a website for an AYSO entity. Certified first aid people or licensed emergency medical technicians hired to be first responders at a tournament or other competition. A landscape company that maintains the fields where games are played, and food or other concession vendors who might contract with your entity to set up a booth during the games. It does not apply to arrangements where you are buying uniforms, goals and nets, or other equipment, and not to Costco, Walmart, or other store where you go to buy things. It should be especially noted that the board did not approve payment to coaches. This was a cultural decision and not a legal one. AYSO believes that our team coaches and assistant coaches, the ones who forge the closest bond with our players and who are with them most frequently, must be registered AYSO volunteers. That being said, the board recognized that providing additional professional soccer skills training was a way some regions could provide a higher quality experience for many of their players and improve the competitive level of play. The board agreed that AYSO entities could engage the services of professional soccer skills trainers under certain conditions. First, the provider must be a bona fide business. If the vendor has a business license and can demonstrate that it provides similar services to other groups or people within the community or elsewhere, it is more likely to qualify as an independent contractor. The local high school or college coach might also qualify. But someone who only provides these services to the AYSO entity and nowhere else would likely not qualify, so such arrangements would not be approved. Use of an AYSO-approved contract for the services contains the necessary protections for AYSO, and through it, both parties acknowledge that it is an independent contractor relationship. The contract also stipulates the technical credentials of the provider and any additional qualifications that AYSO would require, such as AYSO Safe Haven training. In the contract, it is the vendor who assumes the responsibility for conducting background checks on all its employees and for adhering to AYSO's own safe haven standards when convictions are discovered. If the funds used to pay for these skills training or mentoring training sessions come from the AYSO entity's general treasury, they must be open to and available to all players or teams. If additional fees are charged for participation in an extra program or some other secondary program, the training or mentoring sessions could be limited to just those participants, but must be open to and available to all players or teams in that program. Alternatively, a separate fee could be charged for participation in these skills training sessions, in which case they should be open and available to any player who pays. To keep things equitable, in no case can individual teams arrange for or pay for these services. Only the AYSO entity can do so, and only for all concerned. Again, no individual can make payments to a provider. Only the entity may do so. We turn now to payment for referees. Again, this is an option that should be exercised only if it is believed that games will not be covered or will only be minimally covered due to a shortage of trained and skilled referees. First, it should be explained that it would be permissible to use volunteer referees at some levels and paid referees at other level games. Whatever approach is taken to better establish a true independent contractor relationship when paying for referee services, the AYSO entity must secure the services through a bona fide local referee association or other sports officials organization with its own tax ID number. An AYSO-approved form of written contract must be used. The contract contains all the same protections for AYSO that we talked about before, and establishes the qualifications required for the game officials, including AYSO Safe Haven training. The Referee Association or officials organization pledges to perform background checks on its members. In no case can referees be paid directly at a game or competition. The Referee Association must supply periodic invoices for the games conducted by its members, and the AYSO entity pays the association. In turn, the association pays its referees. Lastly, no payments may be made to individual referees. The AYSO entity must make payment and to the association directly. AYSO recognizes that the practice of paying youths under age 18 to referee is widespread. In some states, youth are partially or fully exempt from certain labor laws, but there may be limits to the minimum age and the hours allowed and insurance requirements. Because of AYSO's unique corporate structure, AYSO urges great caution in this area due to these varying state laws. AYSO's resources, both volunteer and national budget, are just not sufficient to compile a reliable set of guidelines for each state. So, rather than just saying no to the practice of paying youth referees, the board would approve such payments if the AYSO entity can secure a binding legal opinion from a local attorney stipulating what is or isn't permissible in that jurisdiction and any insurance requirements that must be met when paying youths under the age of 18. A copy of that written opinion must be sent to the national office, where it will be kept on file. A review of state and local laws should be performed each year thereafter and a new opinion filed if there are changes to be implemented. In any instance where youth referees have been approved, it is AYSO's policy that they be at least 2 years older than the oldest players on the teams they are officiating. Now, some procedural points to keep everything neat, clean, and above board. Wherever possible, secure bids for the desired services from multiple vendors. This helps establish the price point and the market where you are and protects the AYSO entity from overpaying. Next, present the concept and the competing bids in a public session of the governing board and engage in a frank discussion of the identified needs, the costs, and the expected benefits. There should be a vote on the decision involving all of those eligible to vote. Any governing board member who may have a conflict of interest with any of the vendors being considered should refrain from the discussion and the vote. Finally, the discussion and the vote should be memorialized in the minutes of the meeting and those minutes made public. Ensure that independent contractor status is established and maintained throughout the engagement. Later, I will show you where to find more information about determining independent contractor status. At the outset, insist that the vendor provide an IRS W-9 form that includes the vendor's tax identification number. It is commonly believed that collecting this form isn't necessary if the vendor will be paid a total of less than $600 in any 1 year. However, because AYSO is a single corporation, and because there is no way to know for certain if the vendor may be providing services to more than one AYSO entity, the form must be collected at the time of any engagement, regardless of the amount of payment contemplated. Do not proceed nor issue a payment without it in hand. Use one of the AYSO approved contract templates and submit it to the National Office for signature by the National Executive Director. Early in January each year, use the form prepared by the AYSO National Accounting Program to report all such payments to individuals, and submit that report along with all the W-9 forms to the National Office. The NEP personnel will compile all the information and will prepare and issue any required tax returns. We've prepared a page on the AYSO website with lots of information and downloads. On the home page, click on Region Boards menu option. On the Region Boards screen on the left side, click the link to Paying for Services. This is the page with all of the information and links to pertinent downloads. If necessary, scroll down to locate these links to the many handy tools and information. These are links to the IRS website, which provide guidelines to help you ensure that any working relationship is indeed that of an independent contractor. This screen presents more details on the why and how of this policy and the procedures that must be followed. There are links to the template contracts that must be used whenever engaging anyone for services. There are also links to the IRS W-9 form that can be downloaded and printed, and to the 1099 report form to be used when reporting your annual expenses for services to the National Office. So let's summarize all of this. First, this is optional. Nothing about these new policies or procedures is meant to imply that any AYSO entity now must pay for services already well provided by its volunteers. AYSO remains convinced that a well-run program delivered on a voluntary basis by people from the community devoted to AYSO's principles is the way to go. However, in instances where program delivery is suffering, or there is a genuine concern that kids will not be able to play, AYSO is providing an optional practice, but one that must be done carefully to avoid conflicts with federal, state, and local laws. In many cases, these engagements can be controversial and incur significant expense. It is important, therefore, that sound business practices be used when making these decisions, and that the decision process used is transparent and not clouded by any appearance of conflict of interest on the part of any decision makers. Follow the IRS guidelines and other information provided to ensure that any working relationship is an arm's-length independent contractor relationship. Only the AYSO-approved contracts can be used, and without any modification other than the blanks, which are to be filled in by the AYSO entity and not the provider. All contracts must be submitted to the National Office for review and signature by the National Executive Director. Collect an IRS W-9 form from all providers, regardless of the amount originally contemplated to be paid. Insist that invoices are submitted for the services which should be subject to review and approval by the AYSO entity prior to payment, and those payments should be properly accounted for on the books of the AYSO entity using the appropriate AYSO account designations. And in late December each year, the AYSO entity should download and complete the expense report form prepared by the Finance Department of the National Office and forward the completed report in all W-9 forms by the established deadline in early January. If you still have questions or wish to make a comment, either now or in the future, they can be submitted via email to memberservices@ayso.org. Please write "Paying for Services" in the subject line. Thanks for taking the time to become better informed about this important policy of AYSO, and good luck in presenting the best possible AYSO experience wherever you may be.